7 of the most notorious serial killers in history. 7 deaths that closed cases the world could never forget. Some executed, some murdered, some who simply refused to die on anyone else's terms. These are the real stories behind how the world's most infamous serial killers met their end. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy spent the last weeks of his life doing the one thing he had always been best at, performing. Knowing his execution date was approaching and having run out of appeals, he began confessing to murders in a calculated attempt to delay the sentence by feeding detectives information about unsolved cases. He gave over 150 hours of interviews. He cried, he blamed pornography, he found religion. None of it worked. On January 24th, 1989, Bundy was strapped into Florida's electric chair, nicknamed Old Sparky, at Florida State Prison in Rayford. He was 42 years old. Electrodes were attached to his head and right leg. A black leather mask was placed over his face. At 7:06 in the morning, 2,000 volts surged through his body. He was pronounced dead at 7:16. Outside the prison, a crowd of several thousand people had gathered. And this is the detail that hits different. Not in solemn silence, but in full celebration. People wore Burn Bundy Burn t-shirts, set off fireworks, and cheered when the white hearse carrying his body drove through the gates. Vendors sold merchandise. Someone brought a barbecue. It was the most publicly celebrated execution in modern American history. Bundy had confessed to 30 murders across 7 states, though investigators believe the real number was higher. Some estimates go above 100. He took the full truth to his grave. The next killer on this list was executed not by the state, but by a fellow prisoner who believed he was doing God's work. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death with a metal bar in a prison bathroom on November 28, 1994. He was 34 years old and had been serving 15 consecutive life sentences for murdering, dismembering, and in some cases eating 17 young men and boys between 1978 and 1991. He had been in general population at Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin for only a short time. Prison officials had previously kept him in protective custody because of the obvious risk. On that November morning, Dahmer was assigned to a cleaning detail with 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson and a convicted murderer named Christopher Scarver. The 3 men were left unsupervised. Scarver had been collecting newspaper clippings about Dahmer's crimes for months. He confronted Dahmer, pulled out the clippings, and asked him directly if the crimes described were true. Dahmer did not deny it. Scarver beat him repeatedly in the head and face with a 20-inch metal bar taken from the weight room equipment. Dahmer fell to the floor and did not fight back. He was found by guards 20 minutes later and rushed to hospital, but was pronounced dead within the hour. Scarver also killed Jesse Anderson in the same attack. In a later interview, Scarver said Dahmer had seemed to accept what was happening without resistance, as if he was not surprised. He was convicted of 2 additional counts of first-degree murder and received 2 more life sentences, 2 years into a sentence that was supposed to last forever. One of the most disturbing criminals America had ever produced died on a bathroom floor. The next story closes with possibly the most calculated final act of any killer on this list: Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman was a family doctor in the north of England who murdered at least 215 of his own patients over the course of his career. Though the official inquiry into his crimes suggested the real figure could exceed 250, making him the most prolific serial killer in recorded British history. He killed elderly patients, primarily women, by injecting them with lethal doses of diamorphine and then falsifying their medical records to make the deaths look natural. He was caught in 1998 only because he forged a patient's will to leave her estate to him. A mistake so out of character for someone so meticulous that it shocked even investigators who were already suspicious. He was convicted in 2000 and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms. On January 13th, 2004, Harold Shipman was found hanging in his cell at Wakefield Prison using bed sheets tied to the window bars. He was 57 years old. The timing was not accidental. Investigators later established that Shipman had chosen that specific date with precision. His 58th birthday was the following day, January 14th. Under NHS pension rules at the time, if he died before the age of 58, his wife would receive a full lump sum pension payment of approximately £100,000 plus a lifetime weekly allowance. By dying on January 13th, he ensured his wife received the maximum possible payout. His final act was a financial calculation. He never told investigators the full extent of his crimes. He never gave the families of his victims any answers. He took everything he knew to the grave, and even managed to leave his wife money on the way out. The next killer on this list refused to die quietly, and left some of the most disturbing last words ever recorded: John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy had spent 14 years on death row at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois painting clown portraits that he sold to collectors, claiming he was innocent and giving interviews in which he blamed everyone but himself for the 33 young men and boys he had murdered between 1972 and 1978, burying 26 of them in the crawl space beneath his suburban Chicago home. His last meal on May 10, 1994 was fried chicken, French fries, strawberries, and a Diet Coke. When the warden asked if he had any final words, Gacy looked around the room at the witnesses and corrections officers and said two words: "Kiss my ass." The lethal injection process then suffered an unusual complication. The chemical solidified inside the IV tube and clogged the line. The execution had to be paused for 15 minutes while technicians replaced the IV and cleared the blockage. Witnesses sat in silence while this happened. When the injection finally resumed, Gacy lost consciousness within seconds and was pronounced dead at 12:58 in the morning. Outside the prison, a crowd had gathered similar to the one at Bundy's execution. People cheering, holding signs, celebrating. The killer clown, as the press had called him, went out the same way he lived: defiant, unrepentant, and with a smirk on his face. The next killer is the one that no generation seems to be able to stop talking about: Charles Manson. Charles Manson never actually killed anyone himself, but he directed a cult of devoted followers to carry out a series of murders in Los Angeles in the summer of 1969, including the brutal killing of actress Sharon Tate and four others at her home, and the murders of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca the following night. He was convicted of first-degree murder under conspiracy law in 1971 and sentenced to death. That sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in 1972 when California temporarily abolished the death penalty. He spent 46 years in prison, longer than most serial killers are even alive. Denied parole 12 times, never showing genuine remorse, and continuing to give interviews that kept his name in the public consciousness across 5 decades. By the time he died, he had become one of the most recognizable faces in American cultural history entirely by accident. On November 19, 2017, Charles Manson died of cardiac arrest caused by respiratory failure at the Kern Medical Center in California. He was 83 years old. He had been transferred from Corcoran State Prison after his health deteriorated sharply. He had been suffering from colon cancer. He died in a hospital bed, old, having outlived the world's patience with him by several decades, never facing anything close to what his victims' families considered real justice. His estate became the subject of legal battles immediately after his death. The next killer also died in prison, but his story ends with one of the most surprising reversals in the history of American law enforcement. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos killed 7 men in Florida between 1989 and 1990 while working as a highway prostitute, claiming in each case that they had attacked or attempted to rape her and that she had acted in self-defense. Whether that was entirely true has been debated ever since. What is not in dispute is that her death on October 9, 2002, was one of the most disturbing executions in recent American history, not because of how it was carried out, but because of the mental state she was clearly in when it happened. By 2002, Wuornos had spent years on Florida's death row in a state of obvious psychological deterioration. She fired her lawyers. She demanded her own execution. She told anyone who would listen that prison staff were torturing her with sonic weapons and poisoning her food. She claimed she could hear voices. Mental health professionals who evaluated her were split on whether she was suffering from genuine psychosis or was competent to make her own legal decisions. She was executed anyway. Her final words were, and these are worth saying exactly as she said them: "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock and I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie Big Mothership and all. I'll be back." She was pronounced dead within minutes. Her ashes were scattered beneath a tree in Michigan. The last killer on this list never had the kind of dramatic ending you might expect, and that is precisely what makes it so unsettling. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez terrorized Southern California in 1985 as the Night Stalker, breaking into homes at random, killing at least 13 people, committing sexual assaults, leaving pentagram symbols, and creating a climate of fear across the entire region that no single criminal had managed before or since. He was sentenced to death in 1989 and sent to San Quentin's death row, where he spent 23 years becoming something genuinely bizarre: a dark celebrity. He received hundreds of fan letters. Women proposed to him. He married one of his admirers in prison. He flashed pentagrams drawn on his palm at courtroom cameras. He seemed to enjoy everything about his situation except the waiting. He never got to see his execution. By 2013, Ramirez had developed B-cell lymphoma, a cancer of the immune system, on top of liver failure caused by years of untreated hepatitis C. His body, once the physical instrument of his crimes, turned against him completely. His skin turned a sickly yellow from the liver disease, fluid built up in his abdomen. He became unrecognizable from the man who had once strutted through courtrooms like he was untouchable. On June 7th, 2013, Richard Ramirez died in hospital from complications of the lymphoma and liver failure. He was 53 years old. He died before California ever got around to executing him. The state's death penalty appeals process had kept him alive for 2.5 decades. The Night Stalker who had wanted the world to fear him died bloated, discolored, and alone in a hospital bed, which was not exactly the ending he had in mind. That was 7 of history's most notorious serial killers and the real stories behind how they died. If this video hit different, subscribe to Cause of Death. New videos every week going deep on the most famous deaths in history across crime, sport, music, and beyond. Drop a comment and tell us who you want covered next. We read every single one.